Senator Edwards. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to make some comments on the Migration Amendment Strengthening Biometrics Integrity Bill of 2015. This bill does a number of things. Particularly, it simplifies the provisions relating to collecting of personal identifiers. At the moment, there are a number of provisions in the bills, which means that officers who are enacting this legislation need to refer to a number of heads of power, and there are multiple regulations which they apply. But particularly, it will also expand the existing personal identifier collection capability and provide for new capabilities which will increase the integrity of identity, security, law enforcement and immigration checks of people seeking to enter and to depart Australia, and of non-citizens who remain in Australia. And these measures will serve to strengthen the integrity of Australia's borders and our migration program. Specifically, the amendments to the Migration Act do a number of things. Firstly, they streamline 7 existing personal identifier collection powers into a broad, discretionary power to collect 1 or more personal identifiers from non-citizens and citizens at the border for the purposes of the Migration Act and the Migration Regulations 1994, the Migration Regulations. Secondly, they provide flexibility on the type of personal identifiers as identified in the existing legislation, so not actually expanding that, that may be required, the circumstances in which they may be collected and the places in which they may be collected. It enables those personal identifiers to be provided either by way of an identification test or by another way specified by the Minister or officer, such as use of new technology, the scan of live fingerprints on a handheld device. It enables personal identifiers to be required by the Minister or an officer, either orally, in writing or through an automated system, and allow for an existing deemed recipient provisions in the Migration Act to apply in relation to requests in writing. It enables personal identifiers to be collected from minors and from incapable persons for the purposes of the Migration Act and the Migration Regulations under the new broad power, without the need to obtain the consent or require the presence of a parent, guardian or independent person during the collection of personal identifiers. And finally, it omits a number of provisions which are unused and no longer necessary. So before I go on to other details around the bill, I think it's important that we actually address the context of this bill. One of the other committees, which in fact has been sitting today, that I'm involved with, is the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And we've been dealing over the last 12 months with a number of tranches of legislation looking at how we protect Australia and Australia's interests. And so people who are listening to this debate may be aware of the Foreign Fighters Bill. We've looked at strengthening the tool set, if you like, that Australian law enforcement agencies have to apprehend and hold to account those people who go to places like Mosul and the Al-Raqqa province in Syria and participate in activities there with the Islamic State or Daesh and the activities that they're undertaking. We've looked at things like metadata, and we have put in place a requirement for the telecommunications providers to retain a prescribed set of data for 2 years so that they will retain that and make that available to law enforcement agencies who need it. And that's not only in this counter-terrorism space, but importantly that information is used in almost all serious crime, whether that be organised crime in terms of drugs or people trafficking, or particularly the heinous crime of paedophilia and the abuse of children. And so we've put in place metadata laws that provide for that. So this is another piece of legislation that's going towards addressing those issues. At the moment, the committee is looking at citizenship laws, looking at whether it is appropriate to revoke the citizenship of somebody who betrays their allegiance to Australia by virtue of their actions, by supporting terrorist organisations. So that committee is very active, and in the last couple of weeks I have travelled with the committee, with the chair and with the former Attorney General, Mr Philip Ruddock, to engage with a number of our international partners in the UK, in France and in the United States to understand the extent of their measures to address the threat of foreign fighters, to understand their intent in terms of how the issues in Syria may be resolved, and also importantly to understand how we can combat violent extremism. And one of the things that stood out very clearly, particularly as we spoke to people in France, was the benefit that Australia has of having secure borders. And it is no surprise to me that the policies that this government has put in place has not only secured Australia's borders in terms of illegal arrivals, but importantly it's an important tool for the federal police, our security agencies and our border protection staff to have an understanding of who arrives and who leaves this country. And those are quite important when it comes to minimising the impact of Daesh and the very existence of the caliphate, which is drawing people from all around the world, and from protecting Australia from the return of people who have gone and received training in terrorist activities, the use of explosives and other weapons. And particularly as we met with people in France, both their intelligence agencies and also their government and oversight policymakers, it became apparent that one of the real issues that Europe has is that with borders that are now essentially open for people to move from country to country with very few checks, that imposes an incredible burden on them in terms of their ability to secure their nations. And so Australia has a fantastic history, particularly under the coalition of securing our borders, and it's something that we need to make sure that we give our officials every tool that they need to keep our borders secure. The threat also is large in terms of the foreign fighters who are leaving our shores. One of the issues that becomes very apparent as you look into this conflict is that while we have a natural concern about terrorist activity here in Australia, more broadly the conflict in Syria and Iraq, which is a very complex mix of issues between the Assad regime and the anti-Assad forces, but also the Islamic State and those proxies who would seek to support the Islamic State or support those who oppose it, means that the impact on the Syrian population is huge. And so putting our own immediate security aside, just looking at the humanitarian consequences of allowing foreign fighters to go and to support the existence of Daesh or the Caliphate or the Islamic State means that we have around 7 million Syrians who are displaced and currently living in Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. We have nearly 4 million who are displaced internally within Syria, as well as people in Iraq, about 3.5 million people displaced internally within Iraq. And what that means is that there are families living in incredibly dire circumstances. There are children who are receiving at best a basic education, at worst no education. And the long-term risk is that not only will they be displaced for a long period, but potentially they themselves will become radicalised and present a threat to the stability of both Iraq and Syria, specifically to Europe, but even more broadly to here in Australia. So we have a great incentive to make sure that we have measures in place that allow our authorities to secure our borders not only from people returning or coming into Australia, but particularly for those people who are leaving Australia to go and give succour and support to the Caliphate, which by virtue of its very existence is a magnet that causes people to become radicalised and to see this as an alternate to the established Westphalian nation-state that has dictated the world order and, in large measure, since World War II, despite a number of smaller conflicts, has provided stability to the world and the world order. So providing these measures means that, for example, Khaled Sharif, who left Australia and went to fight with Daesh, would not have been able to leave on the strength of his brother's passport. These measures would have meant that people at the border would have had biometric identifiers that would have said this is a person of concern whose records are held by our law enforcement agencies. It would have enabled them to stop him leaving, and we would have seen then not only him personally but the impacts on extended family and other people that have had dreadful consequences for them as well as for the people in Syria. And we've seen reports of the treatment of Yazidi sex slaves, young women who have been bought and traded and sold and abused by Sharif and his associates and indeed his family. Just dreadful consequences that could have been prevented had we had measures in place where departing people were required to have a permanent or a certain form of identification, being biometrics. So these tools you need to see in the context of our security situation as well as the humanitarian situation in the Middle East. We also need to see it in terms of our security here of people returning. When people come back, it's important that we know whether they have been held on a database of concern by our law enforcement agencies or by security agencies from countries overseas. We need to make sure that when they come through our checkpoints at airports, that we are able to positively identify those people so that we can hold them to account for the things that they have done or appropriately regulate what they are allowed to do in Australia. And so our own security, to a large extent, requires these changes. The other area that is important, though, with this, and there's one aspect of this bill, is changing the ability of our officials on borders to take biometric details from minors. Now, that has caused some concern for people who were witnesses to the Senate inquiry into this bill, but what we see is the requirement to be able to positively identify children from a couple of aspects. One of the really disturbing aspects about this current conflict in the Middle East and the way that Daesh is operating is we are seeing that the radicalisation is occurring at a younger and younger age, and so we are getting children in the very early teens who have become radicalised, and there is ample evidence that some of the suicide bombings that have been occurring in the Middle East are carried out by very young children. Now, I completely accept the fact, and we've heard a lot of this in the Intelligence and Security Committee as we're looking at the possibility of revocation of citizenship, that we need to look at children who are caught up in this as victims, as opposed to seeing them as perpetrators. But even if we see them as victims, we need a method to identify who they are so that they can actually obtain the appropriate support to help them in some form of rehabilitation, recovery, reintegration into society, and to prevent them while they're going through that process from carrying out the things that may have been imparted upon them, or the, if you like, the brainwashing that has been given to them, whether it's by a guardian or in some cases a parent or other people who have sought to influence these young people. And so this measure shouldn't be seen as a punitive measure against children. Based on the work we're doing at the Intelligence and Security Committee, if they are victims, then this is a way we can identify that these are young people who have need of the state to intervene and to work with them. One of the interesting things that came out of the discussions we had in the UK was the fact that they are prepared now, they recognise that where a caregiver or a parent is either not preventing radicalisation or in some cases is actually actively encouraging radicalisation or the conduct of events, that the state may actually need to intervene. And we see there the fact that they will take children into state care to remove them from those influences that are causing that damage to the child and the propensity for that child to be prepared to commit acts as a result of the violent extremism that they've been exposed to. And so we shouldn't see these border measures as a punitive measure. We should actually see them as a preventative measure, a way of identifying children who are in need of the protection of the Australian government and the state to protect not only our society but to provide them the opportunity for, if you like, rescue and reintegration. The other group that this bill will address is where there is trafficking, particularly inbound trafficking, people who may be coming in for being trafficked into the sex trade here in Australia, or potentially people who are being taken out of Australia for illegal purposes, whether that be child marriage or for female genital mutilation. There are areas where at the moment we have watch lists for certain people, but this provides another tool that if a child was travelling on false documents with the parent or the person who was facilitating that movement out of Australia for those illegal purposes, that people who are concerned about them, whether that be extended family or friends, have the potential to find a way for our law enforcement agencies to obtain fingerprints and then to match those as they go through immigration at our borders. And so this becomes quite a powerful tool to actually prevent young people who are victims of practices that we do not support here in Australia. In fact, in the life of this parliament have passed laws to make illegal some of the practices such as child marriage, but it also provides us with the ability, in cooperation with overseas powers, law enforcement agencies, to identify people who are being trafficked, to pick them up when they come into Australia, again, so that we can identify and hopefully prosecute those who are responsible, but protect the people who are the victims of that trafficking. Now that's an important part to identify, that in this bill the retention of that personal data, those identifiers, there is a database of non-nationals who, whether they are applying for a visa or for other reasons, their biometric data has been obtained by the government, and it is being retained with all of the normal privacy requirements that the Australian government expects of its agencies and the public expect the government to maintain. But importantly, the data of Australian citizens, if it is held by law enforcement agencies. So an Australian citizen who has a criminal record will have data retained by, for example, the Australian Federal Police, and that data is available to the officers at our borders. But information that is taken, for example, using the portable scanners, which are being proposed at the borders, won't be retained. That data will be recorded, matched, and then it will be deleted. And so people don't need to be concerned that the government is starting to accrue a large database that will be kept ad infinitum of Australian citizens. That data is either because the person has a criminal record, or it is just recorded for matching and then it is deleted at the border. We have also had some people question with minors what will happen to their data, and we had, I think it was Senator Lyons, who was asking whether or not the government actually knew what would happen with that data. There was a question on notice that she had asked, and the answer was given. I had a look at that question on notice, saying that that data will be deleted when that child turns 18, if not sooner. So there may be circumstances whereby the data is reviewed and it is deleted, but in any case, as that person turns 18, that data will be deleted. So This amendment I strongly support because it is simplifying the regulations that our officials operate under, it is streamlining the measures they need to use, it is giving them the tools to protect minors and vulnerable people, to stop people going overseas to fight, and importantly, to protect Australia.
Thank you, Senator.